Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks. This is the podcast / YouTube channel where I, your host Carolyn Hayes, film critic, speak to film creatives about their work in the industry. And today I am joined by writer-director Alex Liu to discuss his new documentary, Sexplanation. And I can't wait to get into it because it's so interesting. It's a documentary about sex and sexuality and why society is repressed and why we are afraid to talk about our own sexuality. So I actually learned a lot and it made me think a lot about certain things. And also joining me today is also a fellow critic, my friend, Paolo Kagaoan, and we are going to really get into it. So before we begin, I usually like to have my guests introduce themselves and talk about what inspired them to create the films and the projects that they're doing. So for you, Alex, you go into it in a bit in the film, like what inspired you to go on this journey about sexual exploration, but from a very cerebral and emotional perspective rather than just about physicality of sex. So what inspired you to create this documentary and to just go into it the way you did? Because you actually talked to your parents, which is something I was not expecting.
I was not expecting that either. My name's Alex Liu. Thank you first for having me here. I think the shortest way I can talk about this is that I think for most of my life, especially after puberty, I've been so angry, just kind of pure anger around the fact that society really in many ways forced me and my family to go through a really painful process of coming out and learning and understanding who we are as human beings, as sexual beings, in a way that when I look back, it just wasn't necessary. If we had just gotten some very simple messages around, sex is good, sex is pleasurable, queer people exist, very, very simple messages, it could have gone a long way to help my family. And I think for most of my 20s, I was just so angry. And then anger served me to a certain point. It served me to a point where I became a health reporter so I can make sure I could get good information out in the world. But by the time I hit my 30s, that anger was just becoming exhausting. I couldn't live a life just being angry all the time. And when I really thought about it, when I really got deep with therapists and talking with people, that anger, I think, was just a mask. It was a defense mechanism for me to really hide and ignore the deep, deep shame I still felt about my sexuality, about who I was as a sexual being, as a queer man, as a queer Asian man. I think a lot of that was something that I still wasn't really dealing with. And so, as I started to, talk to people about it, talk a little bit about my feeling, I realized so many other people had very similar experiences, no matter what backgrounds there were. There was something about their sexuality that they still felt afraid of, and they weren't willing to really, think about or deal with or express because they were so scared of how society might shut them down. So that just became a process of me thinking, well, politically, it seems impossible to get sex ed in schools, at least in the United States. And I have this health background. I have this passion. Maybe I can go around the country in the US and Canada, talking to experts, philosophers, researchers, a whole wide range of people, priests, my parents, and try to figure out, tell them finally for the first time in my life who I am as a sexual being and get them to help me process maybe some things that I haven't really thought critically about for the first time in my life.
That's interesting because the thing with this documentary, one thing I love about documentaries is you never know exactly how the creator is going to tell the story and do the documentary. And for this, it was very much like the film is called Sexplanation, but that doesn't really explain how you go into the film because it is like a sex ed class, and it's a very informative sex ed class, but it's a sex ed class for adults, and it's for adults who know about sex, who know about sexuality, but don't fully understand their own sexuality or sexuality from, I would say, a cultural perspective or even a global perspective, because I'm from the Caribbean, I'm from Barbados, and it's a very conservative country, but it's also very progressive and it's also very liberal in a lot of sense. But because we have such a foundation of Christian foundation, so much of our culture is influenced by Christianity and conservative Christianity, and that things like sex ed. When you learn these things and you learn about, the anatomy, you learn about the body, you learn about sex, you learn about reproduction, but you don't learn about sexuality. And you don't learn about one of the guests, Dr. I have his name here because I make sure I highlighted Dr. William Yarber, who works at the McKinsey Institute. He talked about pleasure and how pleasure is not taught, and the concept of pleasure and from a cerebral point. So I just want you to go into a bit about that, just like looking at from that particular aspect, what like the own discoveries, that the things that they said that you were just like, oh wait, I never thought about this.
Yeah, I think through this whole conversation, I realized just how young it really starts, that we start to shame sexual pleasure. I think, and I don't want to, I'm not blaming parents. I think it's how they were raised, how we were raised, how I felt before making this documentary. But I think we are scared as a culture, mostly globally, that we are scared that if children lean into the fact that their bodies feel good, that they are a sexual being, that somehow they become out of control. Like there's this real fear that children will become out of control, have sex really early, and I think those are good fears to have. We don't want kids to have sex too early. We don't want kids to have unprotected sexual encounters at a young age. But I think the disconnect there is that somehow we think that keeping information from kids is the best way to go about it. But you can't help, if you're born in a body, you just know your body feels good, right? Like it's, you can't hide that. It is a part of being a human being. And I think kids pick up really early that when they talk about their body feeling good, parents will get weird, they'll get anxious, they'll shut down the conversation, they'll say stop. If babies will touch themselves and parents will swat their hands away because it makes them uncomfortable.
Yeah, like actually the thing, when I now that you say like something about like babies touching themselves, because like I actually had to be taught how to do that, or just but at 12, like some kid at school taught me how to do it. Just like, hey,
right, yeah, because I think we all learned that, like, and I get it. Like, I think there is a difference between shame and privacy. Like, there are, it's to have boundaries and to do things in the privacy, to value privacy, I think is, of course, great.
Yeah.
But I think there's no shame in enjoying your body in a private manner, right? And I think a lot of times parents get confused with the two, and I get it. I totally get it. But often kids, they'll pick up things that you don't realize. They'll say masturbation in a public place. They'll touch themselves in a public place, and the answer is like a quick reprimand, and then they never get them the second message, which is like, that's fine to do, but do it in your bedroom or something like that. Yeah.
Because the thing is, it's when I heard like, I guess like kids as young as like 6, like, or like even younger, like do that or whatever. So
I mean, I think you can see in the womb, babies are touching their genitals because it feels good. It's like it's there's a lot of nerve endings there. It's supposed to be good, and that's not a bad thing, right? That's not inherently bad, but we often teach the message that that's bad because we're so afraid that kids will get into trouble. But the alternative isn't like keeping them ignorant and then they'll be safe. The alternative is keeping them ignorant and they'll get into more danger because they'll hide a huge part of who they are from parents. And that's the last thing a parent wants. The last thing a parent wants is for them to be seen as dangerous to talk about these things like sex and sexuality.
Yeah, and I guess it's like within the framework of, I guess, like Western society, or I guess like kids within Western society, we're just like, now that like you talk about like kids, like, like how parents want to shield kids, because like I feel like it's ageism against kids on the kids' part. Like, to be fair, like kids should not have rights, but like, it's also like, I guess like when we think kids, it's like they're on the me phase. Yeah, like it goes from like I want candy to I want something else, and I guess like if we like if parents don't teach them control, they won't control themselves. But at the same time, it's like there's like that like pendulum swing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it totally that you do have to teach a child how to navigate the world. It's very complicated, it's very nuanced, and every kid is different, right? Some kids are naturally kind of private and not as sexual. Some kids are more. It's all very, it's a huge spectrum. But I think ultimately what I've learned through this process is like that if a child learns very early, and it's through usually silence, right? It's discomfort, silence. It's not like an overtly negative shaming message, but if kids learn that like their parents get weird or tense up or at all like kind of freak out when a very innocuous thing happens, like, look, I have an erection or something like that, right? Which a kid they don't know that's like a weird thing. If that shaming message is there immediately, especially when it's really young, a kid will never ever talk about it again. So I think parents, if this is something that they're worried about, have to be clear that it's over and over and over again. They just have to treat it as a normal thing, right? Just like you would talk about your ears and your nose and your elbow. you talk about your penis, your vulva, and those are things that are private and are yours, and no one else should touch them. And be very clear about things like that. Good touch, bad touch. There's really nuance, all that stuff. But I think ultimately, the framing, the whole message has to be like, isn't it wonderful you have a body that is your own, and that you get to do whatever you want with it?
Yeah, and the thing that this film really does highlight, and I think that you and even your parents going through so well, even almost like accidentally, is how it's like we always talk about generational things, like generational curses, generational trauma, whatever. But then you also talk about generational messages and how like parents subconsciously kind of like leave a lot of things out in discussions with regards to sex and sexuality, and also even just our bodies. And like they put them onto their kids, and then they themselves, when they grow up and have kids, they put that onto their own kids, and they don't even realize that what they're doing actually creates a disconnect between your identity as a person and then your own body. Like for me personally, I was very self-conscious as a teenager. I had like really bad acne. I was bulimic when I was in secondary school. I was very self-conscious. I went to an all-girls school, so I was always more comfortable around girls and women than I was around men. And boys, and even boys my own age. And a lot of that has to do with also not only being around girls all the time at school, but also like my own parents, my mom, like we never really discussed relationships, I grew up playing with boys in the neighborhood. But like when it came time to like dating or whatever, like I never really had those kind of conversations with my mom, like even talking about things like period or whatever, like you kind of like parents kind of like assume the school is going to teach you about these things, and they do. But they don't consider how much information the schools actually give you, and it comes to do with, and it has to do with sex, like even your own parents would say, well, we assume the school, would do that in set, so we didn't really like put it as a priority. And even for parents who do talk to their kids about sex and stuff like that, they don't really. To me, this is my understanding from having worked with kids as well, and from talking to my own friends who are parents as well, is like they kind of don't look into the amount of content and the amount of teaching that is being taught about the subject. They don't supplement what is not being taught, and they kind of end up teaching the same thing. And like those the pictures you showed of those the books where they show things like gonorrhea and syphilis. Like I have the same exact books.
It's so universal.
And it was always about, you don't want to get this, you don't want to get gonorrhea, you don't want to get syphilis. But then they also don't talk to you. They don't talk about I guess you could say also personal respect with regards, what I mean? Like, okay, you don't want to get gonorrhea, you don't want to get syphilis, but you don't want to get these things for yourself. You also want to, you also don't want to infect your partner because you respect them as a person and you respect yourself. Like that's never a consideration at all.
Yeah, it's always a thought of like all the things you don't want to get. But what about all the things you do want to get and all the things that you do want to give too? I think it's so. I think as a man, for so long, I thought of sex as something I get rather than something I give, which is kind of like, I think sex at its best is such an interplay of giving and getting, and it's real. It's difficult and it's nuanced. You have to be really good at communication. You have to be really good at advocating for your body and so many things. But if your whole life from 0 to 18, you're told, don't do it, it's scary, it's bad. There's no way when you're 18, you're going to be at all prepared. And your initial sexual interactions are going to be so much worse and so much more dangerous, really, than if you had just had that practice of, like you said, like, how do you actually become intimate while still maintaining respect for a person? Because I think we ignore the real spirituality, humanity of sex, which is the best part, and is the part we're all worried about. How do we make this go well? And I think so much of what we call sex education, which I would call disease and pregnancy education, so much of what sex education should be about how do we make sure it goes as well as possible, not just how awful it could end up.
Yeah, no, that's true. And you talk about the spirituality, which I think is so interesting, because throughout the whole time I was watching this film, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, is so much of what we learn about the world and how we interact with the world and interact with people has to do with religion, like so much is like, especially in the West, but like so much is founded and based on puritanical and patriarchy ideas of religion and sex.
Mm-hmm.
Like you talk to the Republican gentleman who's talking about pornography.
Yeah.
And then you talk to the priest, and like in all of this, I one thing I wanted anyone to mention was how so much of this stems from puritanical ideas of religion and from the Bible in particular, because and it has a lot of it has to do with misinterpretation of the Bible. Like the Bible is one of the sexiest books we've ever read. I've read the Bible.
Songs of Solomon, everybody.
Songs of Solomon, like they talk and like he talks about this woman's two legs are like two doors of cedar. You know, he's like her breasts are like pomegranates. So like he's like that's not only in Songs of Solomon. Like David and Bathsheba, for goodness sakes, he was causing the fall of a whole nation. So he saw this woman across the way on the balcony. He's like, I want her. So much of the and like, but when people talk about things like sexuality, when they talk about the Bible, they say, oh, some Christian foundations. They always talk only about Adam and Eve, you know, about how sex and this kind of thing corrupting mankind, and this is why we made Christianity so conservative. We made religion and sex so conservative. I'm like, yeah, but what about that? Like 75% of the Bible you're leaving out, you know, how the Bible actually does show healthy relationships and healthy respect for people. So I was waiting for like, especially for the priest. I was like, is a priest going to say this? But he did not. So I wanted to talk a bit about that, because you kind of do go into that a little bit with your grandmother, because your grandmother was raised in a Catholic school, and like she kind of touches on it, but she doesn't really go into it. But it was like, I'm like, yeah, a lot of our hang-ups about sex has to do with religion.
I think one of the things that's been great about the movie is helping me understand that maybe not the church, but there is a message in religious texts and teachings of honoring the soul, the spirit, the human when it comes to sex. But I think because, frankly, sex is so intertwined with your identity and values, and shame around that is just the best way we can control, right? And so, you know, it's just the church loses so much credibility because putting aside all the horrible atrocities they've committed against people, but because they don't engage with the fact that we all know that we have sex because it feels good, because it brings us closer to people, because it makes us feel whole in ways that no other act between humans can. And the fact that the church's message is, frankly, it's just for reproduction, you know, it's just for marriage, really does not. It's no wonder that they're losing tons of people every year. And I think the one thing that conversation really pointed out is, because I had been so angry at the Catholic Church, because I had been so just furious at how they really perpetuated messaging that really destroyed much of our family after I came out, that you know, I need help. I do need moral guidance. I do need spiritual guidance when it comes to matters of sex and sexuality, and the ways I turn to it, whether it's pornography, whether it's peers, you know, media, those are not the places that I needed to go. And I didn't have that structure to be able to help me think through the morality of sex and sexuality. So I think, you know, that conversation with the priest, who clearly he's an outlier, he is not someone who's representative of the Catholic Church, but hearing him, I think, was so healing for me, that actually there is a message that's worthwhile of thinking about, and something that I'm still kind of grappling with today.
Yeah, and I guess because when I actually like watched the like movie, it just like when gay Asian Catholic, oh my god, it's like I was like looking at like a more attractive version of myself. The thing is, it's like, I mean, my relationship with Catholicism is like different though, because it's like I was in the Philippines, so it's like Spanish Catholicism, like sin on Saturdays, and then like on Sundays, like you repent or something. And because like what I kind of find, I don't know how germane this is to your movie or like the topics of your movie, but just like it's also kind of disappointing that like not necessarily the Catholic Church, because like as a Catholic, I'm still kind of protective of us. We're just like, hey, like we do things better than like the Protestants do things. So, Carolyn, are you Catholic or Protestant, Carolyn?
I would be considered Protestant because I grew up in Pentecostal church, and then for most of my teenage adult life, I was Seventh-day Adventist. So I'm considered Protestant.
Yeah, in sort of my sort of like prejudiced understanding of it, where we're just like, hey, like we we're strict, but we're not as strict. Like when we're not like Unitarian Universalists, but just like we're not we're not like Southern Baptists neither. But at the same time, it's also kind of disappointing to me that even the Catholic Church would go into instead of attracting members about something that makes them feel good, which that's what sex does. It's like they use anger instead, which like that's I mean, I'm not angry at the Catholic Church. I'm just disappointed by them, which is
I don't know how much of a future they have. If they don't really start to engage where people are, because I think most of the world has really come to understand that their sexual identity is something that they're just not willing to give up because of some texts or some ideas that maybe were relevant 5,000 years ago. So I think my hope is that some people can catch up, but time is running out.
Like it takes a while for a billion people to like change their minds. And I guess there's something kind of like Orwellian about sex, or just like I think or Orwellian about these ideas in general, because like your movie kind of made me think of like hedonism in general, where like now when we think hedonism, it's like, I don't know, eating a cheese board while like getting butt stuff or whatever. But it's like, but yeah, like because like back in the, but like the original hedonism was just like, like eat well, have enough sex, but just like do it in a balance. But just like for some reason, I don't know what the origin of this kind of thinking was, but just like anything good is bad, or like anything good is inherently excessive, which makes it bad. Man,
I think some of these ideas maybe made sense 2,000 years ago, before antibiotics, before birth control, before a lot of the technologies that we have today. But I think that ultimately, isn't it better now that we have these technological don't we all want a world in which we can actually be fully expressed sexually as much as possible? That isn't it better that we all live a life where frankly all of us can have sex like straight men can have sex, right? Like with as little consequence as possible.
Straight men have sex?
Say that again. Well, at least as little consequence as possible, as they walk away from a sexual encounter with as little consequence as possible. And I think ultimately, isn't that the goal? And I guess I get that people have different opinions about this, but isn't the goal, if the goal is equality, sexual freedom and expression and liberation has to be part of that equation.
Yeah. And you say sexual freedom and liberation. So like another thing that I was not expecting, and this has to do with regards to Dr. Yarber in particular, but then also I love her. Kristen Gilbert, who's the professor at British Columbia. Like when she went into her definition of sexuality, oh my God, I was like, I love how she made it a holistic concept. Yeah. And like both her and Dr. Robert were like, sexuality is who we are as people. We are sexual beings. And it has nothing to do with the physical act of sex. It's just that because we talk, because I think is that society has gone to the point where we've narrowed down sexuality so much. Like now, and it's kind of funny the way how she kind of just said it's about our whole being. Where like now, especially there's so much discussion now about sexual fluidity, and whether you're transgender, whether you're gay, whether you're lesbian, whether you're normative or asexual, all these things in the spectrum. But then she was like, she kind of even broadened out the idea of what the spectrum is, and she was like, it has nothing to do with who you are romantically, physically, or sexually attracted to. She's like, it's just who we are. It's just something that we inhabit, because like we as human beings, like everything from the way we laugh could be considered a part of our sexuality. The way we dress, and it has nothing to do with attracting anyone else. It's just about feeling ourselves, and it goes back into what Dr. Yarber was talking about, pleasure. And he's like, we can take pleasure from anything. We take pleasure from the way we dress, we take pleasure from the way we feel. And that's how and they were kind of like, both of them were kind of saying the same exact thing, but from different angles. Totally. And I thought it was super interesting. So for you as the director, like what was it like for you, just like sitting there and hearing them go into these concepts? Like for me, it was just like, ooh, I'm like, okay, lady, go on.
I mean, especially with Kristen Gilbert, I wish I could publish her whole interview, because it was just nugget after nugget. I mean, it felt like, I just felt like 1,000,000 pounds lighter leaving both of those rooms, because there are so many concepts that she explained that I didn't realize I needed to hear that definition explained in that way. That ultimately, I mean, like our crew, most of our crew was either female identified or queer or a person of color. And I think, just being in that room and hearing those definitions, we're all just like kind of bawling at the end, because there was just so much repression you don't realize you have until someone points it out. And to release it, because I think, yeah, you're exactly right. The way you put it is beautiful. That like, if you think about your essence, your spirit, who you are, like when you're in that flow, when you're in that feeling of being exactly who you are in that moment without any control or repression, whatever that is, the way you laugh, the way you dress, the way you talk. I think a lot about how much I controlled my voice to sound more masculine or deep. Like, I don't know if I would, if I didn't have that sexual repression, I think my voice would be different, which is so sad. So I think all those parts, that the lighter it is, the more expressive it is, that's all part of who you are as a sexual being, and I think to think more about sex, like you said, not just as physical intercourse, that's one end of the sexual spectrum, but as that whole playground of who we are in the world, how we show up in the world, and how we treat other people, has been just a huge weight lifted in terms of like, yeah, we're all sexual beings. You can't hide from it. And you can either make the choice to be self-violent and repress, or you can make the choice to try to let go and have fun. And I think that's been just such a much better way, healthier way to live my life.
And Paolo, I want to ask you a question for this, because as you are an out and proud gay man, and that was one of the reasons I asked you to join us, because I wanted to get your perspective, because I said for me particularly, like being heterosexual, and this is a film made from the perspective of a gay Asian man. It was like, I need to make sure that I make this interview, especially in inclusive, because it was like, I need to figure out what someone from your own background and from your own identity thought of this film from your perspective. So that's why I want to hear from you now, because I think it's also important for Alex to get that perspective of having.
Yeah, I would love to hear.
From his own community. Like, this is what I think.
What is it like? I came out when I was 12, and I also did it in the old country, and the thing is, like, I would have like girls tell me like, so you're gay and proud, and it's like, what's wrong with that? But at the same time, like, now that I'm thinking of it, it's like my family also had a lot of money, so there's a lot less consequence for me, which is like, I think, because I think straight people, and there's like that stereotype where like straight people like get a lot of sexuality stuff out like in middle school, and then high school they just go bowling or something. Where like I think after grade 7 I moved here, I jumped straight to grade 9, and just like I think everything dried up. If anything, I felt more oppressed here than I was in the Philippines. But yeah, like there's something kind of like
repressed in terms of like being an immigrant, or repressed in terms of being a queer man.
Yeah, like it'll be just like, where do I find partners? Like it felt easier to like interact with people. Like there was a community, and then like moving here, like in a Catholic school, and like there's only like one other person who came out. Yeah, and like everybody else is in the closet. And then I think my story, like I guess like the only sort of like anger, now that like you say the word anger, it's like I'm not angry at all. Like, but the more you say it, and then like I realize like there's a lot of people that I kind of felt like resentment over, where when a bunch of people graduated high school, like a lot of people came out, and I'm just like, where were you guys? Like I needed you. And I think that's the thing too. We're just like, it's harder for a lot of people who like, like the whatchamacallit, the pioneers, I guess, because like if there's like less of them, it's harder. But like if there's like more of us, like if there's actually a community, which I think I think another thing about this movie is that it's you finding community, and it doesn't have to be like people who have the same sexuality as you, people who look like you. It's like you found community within like straight white doctors.
I think I'm interested to hear. One thing we didn't talk about, which I wish we had the time to do, but it would take a lot of time, and it was a kind of a tangent. I really just want to tell the more simple story of me and my family, and how I got to that point. That was kind of the main through line for all of it. Like it's really at its core, the saddest part about people disconnecting about sex is that it disconnects families. But the whole idea of being like an Asian man in Western culture, and with how Asian men aren't really sexualized, and they're seen kind of as asexual in many ways. And it wasn't until I went to Asia in my adult life where I realized, oh my gosh, like it's just a factor of the culture, and I'd internalized so many negative messages about my desirability and how much I pretended like it didn't matter. But when you go to Asia and you realize like, oh my gosh, like it's there are sexual images of men everywhere, of Asian
Yeah.
men. That was something that was a huge part of my journey in accepting myself and realizing like some countries are better than others, some areas are better than others, and it's nothing to do with you. It's everything to do with the society you're in, and if you have any chance of health in a repressive society or in a racist society, it's really trying to find and accept accept that you as a sexual being is beautiful in and of itself, and that's something that to treasure.
So what I want us to talk about now is the contradiction of society and the ideas of sex, because the thing is, like, having grown up in the West Indies, where I like so much, a lot of our culture, as I said, is very conservative, but it's also very liberal. Like, we have crop over, and crop over is what other people call carnival. And so much of like crop over is about, it's founded on, celebrating the end of the sugarcane harvesting festival, because that's how it started. Where slaves were like, they threw down their tools and they were like, season done, it's time to celebrate. That's where crop over came up. But then over time, it became this whole big event, and it's like it attracts people from all around the world. But one of the main draws of that is that when people come, during Carnival, during crop over, the crop over day, especially Kadooment, people wear the skimpiest outfits possible, and it's about you. And I draw that parallel, because in Western society, it's kind of the same way, where you have so much people say, oh, we celebrate sexuality. We have all these films. We have people talking about thirst traps. Like we celebrate actors and actresses for being hot. They get popular because they're hot. You have magazine covers. You promote films, TV shows, everything on the attractiveness of the cast, and even for directors and even for writers. But then it's like the flip side of that is like the society is so extremely conservative and repressive, and you're just like, it's like two things. It's like these two identities culturally fighting at the same time, and the film kind of touches on that, and it kind of like it's not like a blatant part of the film, but it's like a kind of like a through line in the film, where you have people saying we are sexual beings, but then it's just like we are still, you stop to cover up. You can say all of these things. You can say you're super attractive, but you still gotta act decorously, especially when you talk about for women in particular. Where women are still, you got to be sexy, but not too sexy,
it's a trap.
And the film kind of like goes into that. So we need to talk a bit about that, and kind of like, and your parents are actually kind of a good example of that, where like your dad, like that conversation in the end part where your mom and your dad are talking about sex, and he's like, oh, I was a virgin up until college, and your mom was like, where you go?
I think it's we are a culture that if an alien were to come and look and ask, they would think we're like the most sexually liberal, free culture ever, but if they actually looked at us actually having sex in the bedroom, I think they would think, oh no, there's actually a lot they don't understand, or a lot they're not willing to reveal. We're willing to get naked, but we're not willing to talk about sex. We're willing to have it, but not communicate about it, which is crazy. It should be the other way around, right? And I think for whatever reason, maintaining the silence really does, I think, reinforce the control that many people want to have over our bodies. And I think, it is something, we play with, and with something that can be fun to think about or fantasize about. But I do think most people in the world have not really given much thought to the fact that their discomfort talking about sex contributes to a huge problem about their own happiness and health.
Yeah, because sex is such a fundamental part, I think, of human interactions, because none of us would exist without sex. None of us. We would not be here. But so we're just like, we still get this thing like, I can only talk, like, even like thinking about Twitter, like me and my friends, we talk about sex on Twitter, but you kind of talk about it in code, you know, like you don't really go into it like exactly. So
it's crazy, like a lot of our ads for our movies, they're rejected because they have to deal with adult content. At the same time, you can post a story about like murder and rape, or a movie that's ultra violent, and that's okay. I think it's, I get that many people are still not at the place where when they're confronted with sexual material that they do get uncomfortable. I understand that. but I do think it's just so sad that as a culture we still have to tiptoe around a lot of this stuff, you know.
Yeah, or I think it's, for example, like I guess Netflix has a bunch of crime shows, or like streaming services have a bunch of crime shows, and then like I think one of them talked about vaginal secretions. Like it's okay for like, and that show used to be on like primetime television. You can say the word vaginal secretions at 9 p.m. on a weekday, but like I don't know, like a woman who's like feeling herself, like showing her body, is like apparently like not allowed. Like she's supposed to be a cadaver, which is like, what?
Yeah,
what is this?
like I mean, it's different in many other countries, but like our fear of the nude body too, like to me, like nudity is something that I now am like, I kind of lean into. I mean, you can see her hair, but I mean, like it's something that you know, what, when you ask yourself what really is offensive about the naked body, you know, what really is the problem, you know, I get, like, you know, if pornography or if you're showing actual intercourse, that's one thing, you know, but the fear of the breast, you know, that you can show a male nipple, not a female nipple, you know, a lot of these things that I don't, I can't think of an argument that makes sense that why you can show certain things on TV but not others, and it's something that just baffles me to no end.
So something just occurred to me, and it was a thought I had before. Do you think that the reason that, and I answered because during the film, like you went to a nudist colony, and like I looked away, and the reason I looked away, it wasn't necessarily that I was embarrassed, but I kind of was like taught, and I grew up with the idea that the physical body in all its nakedness is kind of like an external representation of our innermost thoughts. Like, you know, like to really know someone is like you got to understand their brain, but then also to really know someone is to like see them in all of their naked glory, as I would call this. And it's kind of funny to me because I've had 4 major surgeries, and I remember the first surgery I had was a myomectomy, and that's like to remove your fibroids. And I remember after I had the surgery, one of my friends who also had the surgery years ago, she's like, "How do you feel?" I'm like, "I don't know." And she was like, and I know what she made me. And she's like, when you're going to surgery and you have all of these strangers, like I only know one person, that's the surgeon, and possibly the anesthesiologist, because they have appointments with anesthesiologists. But you're like, your body is being exposed to nurses, like other doctors, or the orderlies, people you don't know, and you don't know what's happening to you while you are unconscious. And that thought occurred to me while I was watching this film, because like we don't, our bodies is who we are. And to expose them is revealing so much of ourselves that no one else but us gets to see, unless you have a partner, right? So I think that's I've been wondering if a lot of that has to do with it, where we just like the vulnerability of seeing someone, because like the human flesh is so fallible as well. It's so delicate. Like just to expose your most private parts to people is like,
No, I totally get that. And I think it's such an individual thing. You know, I think some people are much more private about it, and some people are much less, which is fine. Wherever you are, I think it's totally fine. It's an individual choice, and no one should be able to tell you otherwise. I think, you know, the reason we did put that naked montage in the film, why it was so important to me, is because I think for many, I'll say Americans, maybe Westerners, at least in the North America, the only nude bodies they see really are highly unrealistic. It's usually pornography, maybe movies and TV. And it was going to Asia and Europe, where there is like a kind of family spa bath culture, where people kind of get naked and get in the spa, where you see such a wide, diverse range of bodies, where I thought, oh my gosh, like if I had this growing up, might not have had kind of the body dysmorphia I have today. You know, I think just being able to show that bodies come in a much wider range than were presented in the media is something that especially younger people really need to see. Because if you think that the only way that you'll be desirable is having a body like a porn performer, you know, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, although as somebody who has an alt, and just like I've actually like like there's a lot of like, I think we're moving towards a democratization of that. We're just like, I think
everyone's gonna be a porn star in the future, and I'm all for that.
Everybody's gonna have an OnlyFans now. But just like you know, at the same time, it's like there's still like a lot of me to unlearn. Where just like sometimes like I try to post a picture of myself with a shirt or without a shirt on, and just like not this one, delete. Or just like what is like, what is gonna make us like not want to delete ourselves is another thing.
I think it is seeing, it is everyone becoming a little bit more brave to show who they are. I'm not saying you should start an OnlyFans if that's what, I'm not saying that
Yeah.
whatever you're comfortable with. But I think it is like coming out of the closet, making this movie. It can be whatever baby step that you think, with the people that you trust and love. I think like, it took me 20 years of a journey to get to the point where I could talk about this in public. And it was tiny steps, lots of back, sliding back, lots of therapy, lots of screaming, crying, fear. It's not easy. But if everyone can kind of come out of the closet a little bit and show the world, be brave enough, a little bit, who they are as a sexual being, it gives everyone else around them the courage to do the same thing. And if we can slowly reveal who we are, I think kind of in the end, we'll all realize like the first one, what you are is actually pretty normal and maybe even boring. And then two, like it's such a almost mundane thing, like to be a sexual being, that who you are is really just something that is no one's really thinking too much about except for yourself. So why not just try to lean into it and get as much as you can for your own health and happiness.
Yeah, like speaking of like normal and boring, because I guess it's like when most people would describe themselves, they're like they feel normal and boring, but like Carolyn knows that I'm not normal and boring, but like I still feel normal and boring sometimes.
It's true. But that's one of the first things that actually attracted me to you, Paolo, because I remember when we first met, like you were like one of the very few people that, because we met at a film festival. I think it was TIFF, wasn't it?
I think you like the first time we met was like, because like film critics / bloggers would have like a thing here monthly where they would just like drink beer or whatever, and like you like just, I think what's the before the Endgame Infinity War, and like you just like destroyed the like the whole thing, and then just like that was great. I can't even remember what I did that day. I just remember you just like.
But I remember one of the reasons that I even stayed in contact with you was because like Paolo's one of the most expressive people that I know. And like he is who he is, and that's what I like because I'm the same way too. I've been learning how to be more expressive to myself rather than being so constant. Because I'm not a wallflower, but I'm an observer. Where I'm the kind of person where I sit and I watch how people behave and I watch and see how they interact with them. Like if I see how, so I'm also the kind of person like if I think someone is like being ignored, I go to the person that I think is being ignored because I don't want them to feel alone. That's kind of things like they're kind of the same thing. And like your film kind of touches about that because it's about like as you mentioned it, Paolo, is like talking about finding community with people who aren't necessarily like you. And that's one thing the film again isn't the film is about, but it still isn't because it's not about while you yourself, Alex, are a gay man, and while you're showing the film is from your perspective, it's not about the film. The whole idea of the sex isn't about sexuality with regards to labeling. It's just about understanding. And that's one of the things I love about it. It's about just like being able to be comfortable with the people around you and like the people in your own community, whether they're friends, whether they're professors, whether they're doctors or nurses, and just like being able to like talk about everything about who you are as a person, whether it's about sex, whether it's about friendship, whether it's about movies. And that's one thing your film really gets into. So I like, was that ever your intention, or is that just something that just naturally developed?
Oh yeah, it was not my intention. I always thought it was gonna be straight science, straight health, not any of my personal story. That took a lot of time for me to be able to convince me that that's how we needed to go about it. And I think exactly what you said is beautiful. It's right that ultimately how close can you get to a person? How strong can a bond actually be? How much can someone actually love you if they don't know who you actually are? And part of and just core to who you are is your sexuality. And again, that's not to say they need to know how you have intercourse, but they need to know the relationships that you want to form. They need to know the questions you have. You need to show up for them, who you are fully, if you have any chance of a true, real kind of like intense bond and love, which we all want. But if you are always tiptoeing around something, always hiding something, repressing something, that's just so much harder to do. So in a way I didn't expect, I think this movie has been really about like that whole thing, that like, how do we actually love each other? How do we actually connect? Because that's ultimately, in my mind, kind of all that really matters in this world.
Yeah.
And we're gonna wrap up soon, but one of the things that I want you to kind of go off from that, because you talked about your parents in the film quite a bit, and like we're talking about how the film explores different types of relationships and just like using sexuality as a jump off point to getting to know people. How has this changed your relationship with your parents? Because like I noticed there's a difference between your parents at the beginning of the film and at the ending. First, your mom's share was long at the beginning. I was like, exactly how long did it take you to make this film?
I think that was probably like 5 years in between those interviews. 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think I had to go through the whole process of talking to experts, meeting people, going through that whole process of figuring out who I was and what I wanted from my life. And ultimately what I came down to is I do want a closer relationship with my parents. We're getting older. We live apart, on opposite sides of the country. Like, how much of the time I have left with them, I don't want it to be like disconnecting or oppressing or being afraid. Now that's a relationship I want with my parents. Not everyone wants the same relationship with their parents. But I think part of what's changed is a lot of people ask me, like, do you guys talk about sex all the time now? Like, what is it? I'm like, no, we actually talk about sex very little. I think it's something that doesn't come up often, and we're not as interested in each other's lives around that. But now that we've had that conversation, I've now asked them all the questions I was afraid about when it comes to masturbating in the house as a kid, all the things that you're afraid of. Now that we've kind of cleared the air, our relationship is just so much lighter and more engaging. Seeing them talk about like all the inside jokes they have around their sex life, all the arguments they have, seeing that they're like real human beings, not just like godlike parents. Like, they actually have like a very strong romantic and sexual life, something that I think they were probably hiding from me. Just knowing them more in that way just makes our connection just so much deeper and richer, so that when we are together, you can actually just let go and actually start to actually be present and not have to feel like you're controlling every interaction. And that's just been the totally unexpected benefit of this whole thing.
No, I think that's beautiful, because, and it just literally just occurred to me, I think being able to talk to your parents about sex actually makes it easier to talk to them about other things, because if you can talk to them about this most private thing, it should be easier to talk about other stuff, right?
Then nothing else. When you asked your mom, when your mom calls you a sloppy masturbator in front of the whole world, there's nothing else that what else is there that you can't talk about, and that's been something that I didn't expect, but I think I really needed.
Sloppy master. Yeah, I'm just like, I think I shared a room with my dad for like a few years, or I think like we all shared a room, like all four of us, and then it's just like me and my dad, and then eventually I got my own room. It's like, but like the first like decade or so where I had to share a room, my dad was not. How do I do that?
Privacy is good. I'm all for boundaries. Yes.
Yeah, I know that's a great. So as you're wrapping up, one thing, the last thing I do want to ask you, Alex, is, are you going to make a second film? Because you talked about wishing you could kind of like go on a bit more with your parents, and like, will you make a second part? Because I would love to see not only just the discussion between you and your parents, but also how like just this film has ended up making, I guess you could say, making things so much more clearer for you, but also about how has it inspired you as a filmmaker? Because as you said, like you've done one of the most like private and difficult conversations anyone can have on film. What's the next step?
To hear you say that it just means so much. I think, yes, I'm definitely interested in making another film. What it'll be about, not sure yet. I mean, we had so much footage that we just had to cut, which is really brutal, around like gender, around race, around kink, around queer, all these things that I wish we could have dove into. So maybe there's something around that. But I am also interested, like kind of you're picking up that about having difficult conversations, conversations with people that, I think for so long, I just thought my parents were not a safe space to talk about certain things. And I just wrote them off like we wouldn't be able to handle it. But of course they're more willing to handle it. In fact, now I realize like, oh my gosh, there's so much I probably should come to my parents with, because no one else loves me like my parents do. So they actually are thinking about my well-being as opposed to other people in my life. So I think, that's something that I'm just really interested in, like the types of conversations we need to be having as a culture across political aisles, religions, race, all these things. How do we have these conversations that are excruciating to think about, but I think are necessary if we have any chance of survival. So I think that's another thing that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, survival of the species. It all comes with communication.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking with us today,
Thank
Alex.
you.
Thank you
This
so
was
much for
fun.
joining me, Paolo. This is great. This was a great conversation. Okay. So I think that's it. That's where we wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much.
And yes, and I will be linking wherever people can find you on social media. Where can after this, where will people be able to view the film? Because I know.
So if you just go to asexplanation.com, all one word, that'll have all the links to download around the world.
All righty then. So it's free. That's free.
Oh no, it's not free. It's not free.
Okay.
To rent or buy. To rent or buy.
Rent or buy.
Yeah.